All right, so on April 12th, 1999, during a series of lectures given by the Clinton administration, President Bill Clinton was in office at the time, a series of lectures called the Millennium Lecture Series. Mr. Elie Wiesel was invited to speak. If you don't know who that is, Mr. Elie Wiesel is a Holocaust survivor. Prolific author, Nobel laureate, wrote over 40 books, wrote Night, which is kind of a famous accounting of his time in the various internment camps he was in, the concentration camps actually. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. A little bit of background on him. Grew up in Hungary. 1944, was forced into Auschwitz. Most of us have heard of that place. About a year later, his father and him, let me back up. His father and him worked in one of the rubber factories. They were slave laborers. And himself, his father, and his mother, and his sisters were all in Auschwitz. About a year later, the Russians come into the area. So they have what's called a forced march to the camp called Buchenwald, which is another sort of infamous concentration camps. They all were, but those were two really bad ones. And it was there his father, his mother, his sisters died. And he was the only survivor. He was liberated in 1945 by American soldiers, to whom he was very grateful. He actually passed away last year, but spoke for years and years and years about how grateful he was. But anyway, we're not talking about him tonight. We're talking about this speech he gave at the Millennial Lecture Series called The Perils of Indifference. And he started off by saying, we're at the threshold of a new century. We were less than a year away from a new millennia. The 20th century was wrapping up. It was over. And it dawned on him, I guess, maybe, that it was time to reflect on what our legacy is. And the legacy of the 20th century, there's a lot of positive, but there's a lot more negative. He talked about the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., of Malcolm X, President John F. Kennedy, Vietnam, Korean War. The 20th century was very violent. Very, very violent. We were on the cusp of the 21st, and he seemed to want to combat what he considered to be the more perilous of the human nature that tends to cause such horrific things, and that's indifference. And what is indifference? Indifference is neither proactive or reactive. Indifference is, basically speaking, to ignore. Etymologically, it means no difference. It makes no difference to you. Okay. So this has a profound place in his head, because indifference is what allowed the Holocaust to take place. Indifference is what allowed Cambodia to take place, Vietnam. He talked about how it's one of the darker traits that we possess as humans, because on each side of a war, everyone thinks they're right. And yes, we think this side's horrible, this side thinks we're horrible. But we're both acting right. We're both doing what we think is right. One of us is wrong. One of us is not. That's historically, the winner usually gets to decide who that is. But specifically in his experience in the 40s, the 30s, actually, let's back up to the 30s. The Nazi Germany had kind of slowly but surely started to change. Anti-Semitism went from rhetoric to public policy. It became law. And there were many who were all for that. There were many more who weren't. But there were many more than either of those groups who wanted nothing to do with the entire enterprise. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't. I'm not Jewish. Nobody's taking me to a camp. Nobody's shutting down my store. Nobody's killing my family. I'll just stay out of this. It's sad, but I can't do anything. I don't want to do anything. I'm safe. He talked about this group of people they called the Muselmatter, which were a group of, we'll say, prisoners in Auschwitz who were near the end. They had ragged, torn clothes. They didn't work. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep. They just stared blankly. I don't know if it was probably mental stress, physical stress, just you name it. It's a horrible experience. But to him, that was the sort of the embodiment of that apathy that we can have as humans sometimes, that indifference to suffering. And that's the problem he saw, was indifference to suffering. To see another human being going through extraordinary pain, extraordinary upheaval, extraordinary sadness, families being torn apart, homes, lives being destroyed. We just changed the channel. So, in these days, you had, passive versus reactive people. You had people who, on whatever side they were on, they took action. They harbored Jewish citizens. They joined the military. They prayed. They wept. They lobbied public policy. They acted. And Mr. Wiesel and actually the Jewish people kind of as a whole back then referred to these people as the righteous Gentiles. Because more often than not, the Jewish community was in no position to assist. So it was up to Catholics, other Europeans, to step up. And there were many that did. And there were many more who didn't. And that's understandable to an extent. It's a very dangerous thing to do. Because harbor a Jewish family, you're caught by the Nazis, you go to the camp with them if you're not shot on the spot. I get that. But Mr. Wiesel said, indifference is not a beginning. It's not your initial reaction. It's your final reaction. When you've decided to change the channel, when you've decided to stay out of it, there's no more choice to be made. That's not the beginning of your decision, that's the only decision. And he also said indifference is not only a sin, it's a punishment. To the Jewish people in those days, it was one thing to feel abandoned by your fellow man, which a lot of them would later. It was entirely another to feel abandoned by God. For the majority of them were very pious people, and to feel like your father, your God, doesn't care about you is worse than being punished by him. It's, where do you go from there? There's nothing left. But they took a sort of consolation because they were very isolated at these camps, and they just thought that, nobody knows what's going on, because if they did, the world would rise up. They would put a stop to this horror, these horrible things that we're experiencing. There's no way good men would ever allow this to take place. And that was sort of weird. When you're in those situations, you take comfort in what you can. And just to know that you know, there are people that would do something about this if they could, was something. It wasn't great. It was something. But then he found, after he was rescued by the American soldiers, that they knew. And they were, the gentlemen that he met were, of course, just horrified. And he was happy to see them, and he's not blaming them. But President Roosevelt had very, very detailed information about what was taking place. In fact, he talks about the St. Louis, which I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it was a ship from Europe that had 1,000 Jewish refugees on it. And this was after the Kristallnacht, which, if you're not familiar with what that was when basically anti-Semitism became public policy, like I said earlier. That was when Jewish shops were closed, properties were seized. After that, when this was on the world stage, President Roosevelt and his cabinet, his government at the time, turned that shit back. They were on American soil. They had docked. 1,000 people. Turned them back. Because it was certainly politically contentious to keep these people. We weren't at war yet. We wouldn't be for a few more years. But that just kind of shows you how huge of a difference choosing to be indifferent can make. That 1,000 lives destroyed, gone. So it goes beyond just an individual making a choice or not making a choice, whatever the case may be. It's a cancer. It's a sickness that we have as a people, to see the suffering of our fellow human beings and do nothing. So this brings us to the late 90s, when Mr. Wiesel was giving this speech. It was shortly after NATO and the United States joined together to intervene in Kosovo. I don't know if you remember what happened there. Basically, the government at the time was forcing Kosovo Albanians out of the country. Lots of lives torn apart. People captured, tortured, killed, drove out of their homeland with nothing. And he said that our response in that situation was actually pretty quick. I mean, it had been a year ago from when he gave this speech that policy had come into place. We acted very, very quickly from a political perspective. Nothing happens quickly, but he wondered if maybe we had learned from the past. Finally, the lessons that we learned in World War II led us to make the right decision in that case. And Kosovo's still a little on the controversial side to this day. It's considered a humanitarian war. Those concepts are a little antithetical, but what have you. I'll let you make up your own mind about that. But he credited a little bit of television, because while television was around in the 40s, it wasn't like it is today. The 24-hour news cycle didn't exist yet. So a lot of what spurned public opinion towards action in Kosovo was images on television, specifically children. Children being forced on the buses by themselves, going who knows where. Children bleeding, injured. Children dying. Starving. These images were hard to watch. So we acted. And for better or for worse, 800,000 Yugoslav Albanians, Kosovo Albanians, were forced out of their homes. 500,000 got to go back. Call that a victory if you want to. But the reason why, when I was selecting a topic for this speech, the reason why I picked this, the reason why it spoke to me, is when I was reading this, a lot of parallels. Well, I noticed a lot of parallels today. We see refugees in Syria on the TV every day. Hear about them on the radio. And there is a large swath of the country, a large group of the country that feels like the best way to handle that situation is to keep them out. It's people who have experienced things that we're unlikely to ever experience. Horrible things. We don't want them. Not be terrorists. We don't care that they're suffering because they're from this part of the world. That scares me. It terrifies me. It terrifies me that we have allowed, at least for now, indifference to other human beings creep into our consciousness as a society. We see these people in pain, inexplicable, unknowable grief, and we change the channel. So, if you have a moment, this speech is very easy to find online. I'm actually going to link to it when I post it this evening. Please give it a listen. But whenever you're posed with a decision between making a choice that can make another human being's life better, or moving on down the road, make a choice.